Okay. Sorry about that. Apologize for the technical difficulties we had this morning. So I'll pick back up. So I spent a lot of my career in the services business and feel like I have a real good appreciation for the kinds of things that our clients and many of you on the phone have to deal with every day. So with that, I did want to mention, as Thomas did, we had intended to have Bo DiMuccio, the Vice President of Professional Services. He runs the research operations for the PS part of TSIA. Had a very unfortunate situation come up this morning, and he passes on his regrets of not being able to be here, and we were sorry he was unable to make it, and certainly understand why. So Bo is just a terrific guy. For those of you who haven't met him, and TSI has got just a first-class research operation, and I'll be sharing some of the data that we have that they put together. So our company, we're based in Cincinnati, located, we have a regional office in Washington, D.C. We are, at our heart of hearts, we are a company that provides management and operational consulting entirely to services-based entities in mostly technology companies, so hardware, software firms, some pure services firms, and we provide all forms of operational and strategic planning, including transformational planning, and we really take pride in our rolling up our sleeves and helping people with the actual transformation of their services business, whether it's PS, support services, educational services, or shared services environments. We're very skilled at all of those. Some of our clientele, this is all available off our website. This is just a sampling of the companies that have put their confidence in RTM Consulting to help with a variety of matters and issues relating to their services, environments, and operations. So, from a TSIA perspective, the research organizations in TSIA are aligned with the different verticals that TSIA supports, which includes support services, field services, PS, a newer line called service revenue generation, focused on the ability of services to drive new and greater revenues as well as protect revenues in the services environment, and educational services. And in each of those verticals come with a complement of things they do, including advisory boards, research teams, benchmark surveys, etc. And so Bo DiMuccio represents the center box there for professional services. This is just a view into the research services that they provide. And so, again, I won't be as eloquent as Bo would be in representing this, but they do a variety of webcasts and reporting relative to financial data for public companies, one called the Services 50, the Cloud 20, and the top 20 services businesses in Europe. They do have a very active benchmarking organization, and we will be sharing with you some of that benchmark information as it relates to pricing this morning. The topical studies that they do, so as an example, they've got an upcoming one on project performance, and there's some excellent studies out there, and then a variety of other case studies and other peer networking opportunities. They've got one upcoming on cloud offerings as an example. So anyway, TSIA.com for their website, and just a terrific association and first-rate research. And again, we're pleased to have the ability to share some of their data. So let's jump right in here and talk about our topic of the day. And I'm guessing that some of this sounds familiar to all of you. And our average price is $185 an hour. Why are we only seeing $132 an hour in realized rates? Sales team perhaps complaining that our rates are too high. The competition has much lower rates. That pricing approach will never work in my market. PS margins are too low. We need you to focus on reducing labor costs. I know that many of you have heard, one or more of those particular things through the course of what you've been doing in your roles in the services-based operations. So you're not alone. The industry clearly struggles with this, and I'm not quite sure why the industry has waited so long to finally address and deal with these issues around pricing. But there is some progress starting to be made today, and I'm hoping that this webcast will help bring some perspective to those who have chosen to participate today in our session and be of value to you. So, you have to judge for yourself where you are today. When we go look and talk to an organization about pricing strategy or pricing execution, we see organizations that run the gamut from the rudimentary, where pricing is not fact-based, it's cost-plus based, it's in line with a broader solution and it is a line item on those invoices, and there's not much pricing structure or process in place, and causing the organizations to be very reactionary in how they deal with pricing in the marketplace. Versus at the other side of those organizations that are very sophisticated here would have the attributes of being very strategy-driven from the top down. They very fact-based in how they've arrived at their pricing mechanisms. They're very market-aware and have adjustment capabilities to adjust as pricing conditions change in the marketplace. Cross-functional execution, which we'll spend a fair amount of time on this afternoon, is a big challenge for organizations. And as you'll see, I'll talk about the many potential points of failure in executing a pricing strategy and where the breakdowns typically occur. And certainly any good process has got governance built around it. And the organizations that do these 5 things well have those attributes in place. You'll find have a very predictable environment relative to the price I put as list to the price I ended up with as my realized rate, and typically the gap between those is much smaller for those with more predictable results. So moving on, this is a picture that I'm guessing many of you have drawn as you're trying to work through pricing issues, pricing matters, trying to explain realized pricing versus list pricing to the teams or senior management in the organizations. Everybody, generally speaking, has some kind of a list price, and that list price may be tiered based on the kind of work you do. It may be tiered based on the geographies that the work's being done in or other types of things. Typically, there is some mechanism for discounting provided that either through formal or informal methods, the sales teams discount at some level based on the size of the deal, the type of customer, the strategic value of the opportunity, and so there's some kind of a contract rate that's based on discounts that have been applied. And then there's certainly to the far right of that, there's what we call the realized rate, and that's essentially what ended up actually being realized in the marketplace. And so organizations continue to try to look at the difference between list and realized, trying to figure out where did the breakdown occur. And by the way, it may not be a breakdown. Maybe with just the view is that the spread is too wide, and we've seen this, by the way, the spread be enormous between a realized rate and a list rate. And that typically, by the way, is not normal. It's not what you'd kind of want to have, and you'd want more predictability in your pricing mechanisms to provide more predictability in your revenue stream. So, real important. So, I talked about potential points of failure, and I'm going to use this graphic as I work my way through the presentation this morning because it really helps to bring, for us, clarity to why pricing mechanisms fail in companies, and simply because pricing is something that spans so many different cross-functional organizations, and there's so many, therefore, potential points of failure. So could start at the corporate side where there's just a lack of clarity around pricing or how margins are to be achieved. PS may or may not have a realistic rate card, and so there's a potential place where it could break down. Sales, if the sales organization is not disciplined around discounting, you could find you have heavy discounting going on where perhaps it's not necessary. Unrealistic expectations from finance about what we really can get done in the marketplace. There are marketplace realities. There are things that relative to our strategic customers we deal with, and then last is how we market ourselves from a value-based perspective. Do we have congruent or incongruent messaging as it relates to how we convey our value proposition to the marketplace? Perhaps we've got ad hoc research. Do we base our prices based on facts, or is it based on ad hoc research that in the light of day may not hold up? And so, there's this is a challenge, by the way, keeping these 5 things in concert with each other, starting from that strategy and working its way around the circle, is something that processes do a great job at. Is we build a process, we build governance around those, we manage, we continuously improve, and so those are all things that can that a good process can address. So we developed the pricing execution framework, the RTM Consulting pricing execution framework, to bring a more systematic approach to how companies address and approach pricing. And again, I'll be using this circle combined with the one I showed on the prior page to show how you can build a disciplined process in order to bring more predictability and hopefully better margins as it relates to how we enable pricing in our marketplaces. And so, and it starts with again, having a pricing strategy, developing a mechanism to gain organizational alignment, having processes that overlie those various cross-functional organizations to control the mechanisms around pricing, that there are pricing inputs that I'm getting from interactions in the marketplace. Hopefully I'm not using one source to be just sales, to include market research and other places that collect pricing information. TSIA is one and a good example of an organization that collects certain types of pricing information as another source of data, so you can, I'll call, triangulate your data as you're building your pricing strategies. Automation support is, many of the companies that we're talking to on the phone today have a professional services automation tool or a project and program performance PPM tool to help manage cost accounting, manage project performance, manage resource management and things, but yet we find organizations generally don't use those tools as extensively as enough as they could be or should be in order to feed their pricing processes and continuous improvement processes. And then last, again, is certainly process governance. So these things make up our pricing framework, and when we work with companies that have pricing concerns or needs, we use this pricing framework to help decompose their business and how they're executing pricing in the marketplace, and recompose what I'll call a more structured approach to pricing based on best practice application at each step of the pricing mechanism or framework, in this case, as we call it. So I'll start with the first piece of pricing data. Again, I want to make sure I attribute this data properly to TSIA. Comes from a recent benchmark that they did in this area, and this is the first piece of data that Bo DiMuccio would have offered up, and has in his presentation. And virtually all organizations set their prices based on some kind of a cost-up approach. There's been very little movement over time as he's compared the recent benchmark to prior years, but always offers up the question, does common practice necessarily equal best practice? And we're not going to try to convince anybody today that a market-based rate is better than cost-based, or a value-based rate is better than cost-based. We do have an opinion in those areas. Some of it is driven by your market, your product, your service, what you happen to be doing in the marketplace. But interesting is one important element of driving your pricing strategy is deciding, what is my mechanism going to be? Am I going to be cost-based, cost plus, or am I going to be value-based, or something in between there? So an interesting data point to say the least. And so when we think about pricing strategy, we think very heavily about, okay, well, let's just get our facts. Where are your rates today, and realized rates? What are you actually getting in the marketplace, and what kind of margins are those rates driving? And that's a great place to start. And then, of course, comparing those things to what are my list prices, how big is the gap between what I wanted to get and what I actually did get, and where are my points of failure that did occur, as I discussed earlier. A part of a strategy is, what do we want to accomplish? Do we want to be a price leader? Do we want to be a value leader? Do we want to be a premium provider? Do we want to be the low-cost provider? And again, there's not no one right answer, but I will say, though, is you got to pick one and drive that into the marketplace, because your pricing strategy is going to vary dramatically depending on the choices that you make at the high level. How do you support the strategy? And that's getting the right kind of data. What's the message I'm going to convey to the marketplace? Air cover you're going to provide for your sales teams, and those sorts of things. And then certainly, what do we want the result to be? What kind of margins do we want? What are our financial targets? What do we expect our realized rates to be? And actually putting those things in concrete, setting objectives, and then as you build your pricing process, build your pricing strategy, that you can begin to track against those things to determine whether or not your strategy is working the way it was intended to do, so you can make refinements along the way. This graphic at the bottom here really is intended to pick somewhere you're going to pick whether or not I want to be value-based versus cost-based. And by the way, you notice there's no results axis on this, because your results actually could vary. And again, this is not intended to imply that value-based is better than cost-based. It is intended to imply that clearly there are choices to be made that are going to drive downstream results and reactions. So the second thing on our as we work our way around the framework is gaining organizational alignment. And the data here is quite compelling. Is virtually all PS organizations, or most organizations, have challenges around pricing alignment between the organizations. That's the bad news. The good news is people recognize this, and I'm actually surprised that the 20% have high alignment, because it really is reflective of what we always see. But I think this is a pretty good research base that they drew upon here, and I tend to believe their data pretty much. So I think the good news here is people know that awareness of that alignment's not something we're all good at, and we need to get better at that. And so when we think about organizational alignment, again, is this is more of an, I'll call it an exemplary side, but an important one is somewhere corporate's got to drive a strategy. How do we want pricing to come together? Because again, some people might want to give away services to sell products. Some people might want to use services actually to drive more product sales. Some people might want to use services to drive more margin. Everybody's got their way of going about it, but it does start with the strategy. PS has got to have generally would have a rate card that supports whatever that strategy is. Sales would has to execute, and there needs to be some kind of controls or mechanisms around that, so your realized rates come out the way they need to. Governance, typically, finance has some involvement in governing that, measuring, monitoring, reporting, identifying where breakdowns occur, and then certainly, marketing's got the job to help with the research behind, what our pricing's going to be and how do we convey our value proposition to the marketplace based on the pricing strategy that we have chosen for our particular company. So, all good stuff that is important relative to gaining organizational alignment in your company. So, as I mentioned earlier, a pricing process really brings all these things, starts bringing these things together, and starts to bring the mechanisms via how which we execute a pricing strategy in a more deliberate and controlled fashion. And so, when it comes to having a documented process for managing pricing and price performance, again, not a surprise from the benchmark data, is that this is an area that's still in its infancy as it relates to most PSOs and most technology companies. And the question you have to ask yourself is, what is the cost to the business based on a lack of process or deliberate management of our pricing structure? And again, all your organizations are the ones that would know the answers to those questions, but again, generally speaking, we find that organizations are not always, are more largely unhappy with the gap between their realized rate and their list prices. And so as we think about pricing processes, we like to think about, again, is building the mechanisms into a documented process where that is communicated, that we educate each entity that has a responsibility to execute the pricing strategy. And that starts with, again, an effective development and communication of the strategy from corporate, for professional services, to set prices based on that strategy, develop controls and PS around that, tracking, continuously learning from that. On sales, it's really come down to three key elements: is training, giving them the right kind of pricing tools, making sure their compensation supports their adherence to these kind of pricing mechanisms. On the finance side, it's reporting, tracking, looking at deal approvals, perhaps that occur where these great big deals where people tend to want to discount more heavily. Are we really actually looking at over a certain threshold, every deal, to make sure that we have some governance over the actual prices that are going into the marketplace. And last, again, is that that we make sure that marketing is aligned and supportive of communicating, creating the right kind of messaging around our value propositions, doing the right kind of research as inputs into our pricing strategies. So a lot of things there around building good processes. So price intelligence, well, lots of places you can get data, but again, not a surprise here that organizations tend to rely on the field and sales for input. And by the way, not that those are a bad thing. There's lots of good intelligence comes out of the field and sales, but the message here that we would have for the marketplace is don't rely on any one source of data too much, and don't rely on just one source of data. And finding a way to develop systematic inputs from a variety of sources so you can triangulate your data, whether that data is coming from research organizations like TSIA, other competitive intelligence, partner inputs. It's kind of surprising here people have no inputs in pricing. You kind of wonder how that's occurring. But finding multiple inputs of data that you trust, that you rely on, that you can begin to triangulate and help you formulate, what should our list pricing be based on what we have decided as our pricing strategy. And so when we work with companies in this area, again, we clearly try to drive them toward branching out into multiple sources of systematic data. We've got our opinions on where we think that comes from. And many of you, I'm sure, have found places that we would consider reliable data as well. One point of failure we tend to see, though, is that be careful about what you're comparing when you start comparing prices. Are you comparing solution-oriented prices where those prices have been taken into context of some larger deal that may be important to that company, whether it's product prices or maintenance prices or whatever it might be? Is it hourly? Am I doing block pricing, where I've allow you to pay by the day or by the week or by the month versus hourly? Because there's discounting built into those. Am I focused on margins? What about mapping my prices to certain type of roles? So when I look at your dollar rate, am I comparing the same kind of job rates fairly in the marketplace? So there's some amount of what's called disaggregation of the data that needs to occur if you really want to be disciplined about this. And then last is segmentation, and geo and markets are certainly not the only way to segment your pricing, but just two that happen to be just say more commonly deployed would be by geo or by a marketplace. So it's a little bit about pricing intelligence. This is not a surprise again, but one of those ones where there's a real opportunity for companies. 3/4 of whom in the benchmark said we have a PSA tool in place, but yet we're only a third of companies are actually using the tool to help them with pricing. And our we do a lot of work with a variety of PSA vendors, PSA tools, and companies implementing those tools and building processes around them. And our general observation is very much in line with this data, that there's all this great data on pricing that's going into the system that could be used, again, as another great source of pricing intelligence as companies try to build their ability to build better pricing mechanisms in their company. And so using the tool to track, monitor, sort, list, analyze data, take advantage of the things that you've invested in here in your PSA tool. Everybody's got, one of these kind of things is, how are you using it, and are you taking advantage of what it's capable of? And so we, again, as we implement one of these pricing processes, we help organizations start to use those tools at corporate, using it to help model out their strategies. The PS side is building up, you're taking advantage of a pricing database, looking at price performance tracking. At the sales side, it's, what's the gap between the rate card and what I actually sold it at, building, pricing tools for them. Finance can get lots of reports, budgets, inquiry, or queries from these systems. And again, marketing is a great place for research data. And by way that communications can occur as well through the PSA tool to help organizations with this area that so many tend to struggle with. So then I move to the last part of the circle, and that happens to be around process governance. Process governance is like any other processes. Our processes are only as good as our governance mechanisms. And so, I would just say that just some simple ones is setting up, documented, accessible, simple policies. By the way, they would include, metrics, around these sorts of things. But so I imply that through policies, but that those simple policies ought to be this is how we intend to instantiate or make the strategy that we've decided at corporate come to life when we deploy it into the field. Deal structure reviews I've found to be completely invaluable to organizations, is having regular deal reviews over some threshold amounts that basically said, we allow the various cross-functional entities to weigh in on a deal. And generally speaking, while some people could perceive this as bureaucracy, I've seen them where they're implemented well, end up actually producing a better end result for the company, which results in better margins and more competitive deals. Escalation processes, so that when we have honest disagreements in the organizations, there's a way to resolve those in a disciplined way. Good tracking and reporting, so that we can get constant feedback on how things are working, with a real focus on realized rates. Because in the end, all that really matters is, doesn't matter what I put in the list card or rate cards. What does matter is what my customer actually pay. The ability to make market rate adjustments. One thing about pricing is prices change, market pressures change, and we need to build flexible mechanisms to be able to respond to that. And then lastly is incentives. Do I have the right incentives in the system, in the sales team and the PS teams and people involved in the ecosystem, to have people with we'll call it skin in the game as it relates to successful execution of the pricing strategy. So all things that are important to the governance process. So I thought I'd share with the group some tips from the trenches, as I often do on these webinars, of things that we've learned that I'm hoping will be helpful, points of wisdom for all of you. Is this is pricing is always tends to be an emotional area for a lot of companies, and I've just generally found that PS organizations who generally speaking aren't the ones setting corporate policies around pricing, but do have the ability to provide an enormous amount of influence, as well as information and guidance to the company on how to get more from the marketplace. And so, I always just advise PS executives, don't sit around and wait for someone else to fix it for you. Jump in the game and work on trying to, if your company hasn't adopted a cross-functional pricing ecosystem, be the person that's proactive about bringing it forward and saying, hey, I think this is going to help us. The chance to be a company hero and and affect your own outcomes in your organizations at the same time. I haven't found any company that doesn't care about pricing right. Solutions sell. Everybody wants to make money, and so you won't find people that are honestly interested in finding the best possible way to extract the most amount of value from the marketplace. So generally speaking, corporate management's pretty interested in this topic when approached in the right way. One place companies tend to break down is that they build a great strategy, but they don't communicate it effectively in the marketplace. They don't give sales the right kind of air cover. And I've been in a sales role. Many of you on the phone might have been at some point in time in your careers, and it's not easy selling. And but good air cover, good messaging is always helpful in the marketplace. Is where companies, the buyer perceives value, that gets translated to price, and it makes the job of selling easier. Building trust in your data and proposals is really important. So fact-based is really the operative words here is get great sources of data, analyze it, create lots of transparency to the data so that people have confidence in what you're actually bringing forward. A good pricing process, takes emotion, out of your arguments, out of the arguments that people might have around pricing strategy, and clearly we've seen improves a business's odds of success when they do this. So I'll before the Q&A, and we will take Q&A from the attendees. I do see a number of questions coming in already, and so key takeaways is again it starts with the strategy, so again from the top of the loop, and I'll put back up here in a moment the data or the framework so you can see that again, but get reliable, competitive, comparative data. Make it fact-based. You got to build a process around this. Train and equipping the team with the right pricing tools is pretty important. Particularly the education process that goes around this, and then like any good process, building some kind of a governance mechanism around that. So I know that in the our marketing director Thomas Meredith is going to put we'll put this onto our website for on-demand viewing if you want, but the framework we've been talking about, starting with again the strategy, building organizational alignment, building your pricing process, building getting the right kind of intelligence, using your PSA tool, and then building governance around it, pretty important, and that's what I've been driving through today. So I'll put up the our contact slide for both myself, and I know that Bo would appreciate questions, even though he was unable to make today's webcast. So feel free to, if you have questions about TSIA or TSI's research information, please don't hesitate to send him an email, or myself, by the way. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Thomas and take questions from the attendees.
Okay, thanks, Randy. Great job on that content. There was a lot of good stuff, both from RTM Consulting and TSIA, and appreciate you doing double duty on that. I'll let you get a little glass of water here, a little drink, and we do have a lot of questions coming in, and I'll get started here if you're ready. This one came in from Chris, and he's talking about pricing is a complex topic. I like what I've heard. Thank you, Chris. He asks, where do you start when you currently really do not have a cohesive pricing strategy or process? Where do you start?
Okay, so that's a great question, and I would go back to that graphic I had up there a moment ago, and it really kind of starts back with the strategy and getting data to bring attention to the problem, right? So we start with really understanding what is my gap between my realized rate and what I wanted to get. Taking that data, and by the way, I take research data, research reports. Some of this TSIA data is fantastic information that corporate executives like to see because good companies are always trying to compare themselves to their competition, the best practices in the industry. and grab the availability of good data that you have on how things are working, where you see the points of failure. If you have a lack of a documented strategy, take our pricing framework. Say, hey, look, guys, I think we need something that looks kind of like this. By the way, the industry is, better companies are driving towards improving their margins through getting more handle on pricing, and I think I have some ideas on how to go about that. And so, I'd be starting with, getting my facts, getting my data, getting industry research that kind of brings attention to why we should fix this or get better at it. Even if you don't consider it broken, there's always, every company's always got room to get better at this and extracting more and more value from the marketplace. But that's where I'd start, is understanding the nature of the need, the problem. You pick your adjective, and garnering enough data that says, hey, I think this is an area where we can be better.
Okay, this one is coming in from James. It's again about kind of the process. He wants to know, what are the biggest roadblocks you see in getting a pricing process in place?
To me, it's that cross-functional picture that I talked about earlier, and every company's got its own culture about how things like this get resolved internally, and for some, it's a collaborative. Hey, I'm going to get together with my peers, and so if you remember that picture, I get together with the corporate strategy person, the sales leader, the marketing leader, and say, look, I got some data here. I don't think this is working to our best advantage. I think we can get better at it. For some companies, that won't work. There's just too much debate or disagreement, and it's got to be driven tops down. And so I'd come back to what I was asked in the first question by Chris, which was simply, I'd get my, I'd figure out, how do I bring attention to the problem in a proactive and positive way, highlighting that, other companies have solved this problem. There are a variety of ways to go about solving the problem. We need to pick a method and go by doing it. But the biggest roadblock I see to this is just getting getting people on board to say, okay, we agree that we have a problem. We agree that we can be better. We agree that there are perhaps different approaches we should discuss, but we want to get better at this. So it's cross-functional issues, I think, that generally tend to get in the way of this early on in the process.
All right. I got one here, and I've seen a few questions come in and around this idea around discounting, and so I'll just ask this one from Mark. He says, are there one or two things you can do that have the biggest impact on limiting discounting?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I would a couple of things that I would throw out is these. I mentioned this idea of deal reviews, and what I've generally seen, and I spent quite a few years of my career in sales, and so I feel like I could say this in a way that hopefully doesn't offend anybody in the sales side, is that it's always easy to discount. And what I always found when I was a salesperson is when I was forced to defend why I wanted to price something some way, that nothing but good came out of that, because a lot of times it would cause me to realize that, hey, perhaps I was clouded by my being so close to the customer or the situation, and so getting some cross-functional input into deal structures, I never see that unless it's just run really badly. I never see that it turn out to be anything other than a good thing for companies. And so one of the things I like deal structure reviews or deal reviews at some level. And again, as I wouldn't be bringing a bunch of people together for a $1,000 deal, but if I pick some threshold, whether it's 50,000, 100,000, a million, I don't know. It depends on your company, so that you don't have too much bureaucracy here. But for the bigger deals, it's worth a half hour of somebody's time to look at a deal structure and decide, have we put our best foot forward? Do we have the best pricing approach here to extract the most value for the deal? So I think that's definitely near a higher one on the list. A second one is a combined given sales the air cover to sell the value proposition of the company in a marketplace, so the customer is conditioned to want to pay something more for what you sell because they have at least some level of perception that you have more value than perhaps the competition would. And on the sales side is making sure salespeople are given the right kind of tools. Things are like return on investment calculators are great ones to, when, even in our company, when a client pushes, a prospect pushes on price, we tend to push on return on investment. Is you look at them, Mr. Customer, here's what you're going to get back for this. And so giving sales the right kind of education on how to sell the message, how to use good tools you provided, and equip them to be able to push back on customers that want discounts in a proactive, positive, disciplined manner. And really great salespeople are really good at this and know how to sell value and price. But they need tools and education like any of the rest of us do in our vocations, and so properly equipping them. So those would be the two things I think would be kind of top of my list. If I sat around for 10 more minutes, I'd probably come up with 2 or 3 more, but those are two that jump out the top for me.
Right. No, those are good. Yeah, I saw a couple questions around that topic, so I wanted to make sure we got that one answered. There are a few questions coming in asking about, and I think these will be Bo questions, kind of talking about the research and the rates and how they're trending. We'll get these questions answered to you guys offline, especially some that I think Bo would be better off answering. I do have one here from Jessica, and she asked, how do we make choices between pricing approaches, for example, value-based versus cost-based versus market-based or some other approach?
Yeah, that's a $1 jillion question, right? It's
right.
it gets asked all the time, and again, as I mentioned early on in the presentation, I don't think any one of those three is the right answer or the wrong answer. I think the answer is it depends. It depends on what your pricing strategy as a company is. And so if the company, for instance, is selling its products on a cost-based basis, kind of hard to not have a cost-based pricing mechanism on the services side. And the same would be true if I'm selling value-based. I tend to want to package a solution price a lot of what I do, and therefore you have to have cohesion between how I'm pricing products and pricing services, because I'm trying to sell one set of value to the marketplace. This is particularly obviously important when it comes to cloud-based services, right, where a customer's paying a subscription price and they're trying to justify, okay, well, why do I pay per person, per head count, per user, and and I start adding up the money and try to figure out, am I getting a good deal or a bad deal here? And it's a complex question that has so many elements as you're building your strategy to consider. It's what is my company strategy? How do I want to extract value from the marketplace? What is my value proposition? Do I want to be a low-cost provider? I mean, some organizations, that's not the wrong thing. It's what they've chosen to do. And some organizations are, I want people to understand we are a premium provider. You're never going to get the best price for us, but you're going to get the most value in what you do. And somewhere in between that left-hand side of that, low-cost provider and the premium value-based provider, there's an answer for your company that's somewhere in between. But key message here is that there's got to be cohesion between how I price the other things that my company sells with services, and that's got to be done with forethought and those kinds of things. So I really think that's really important for organizations to grapple with that. Where we find, by way organizations really struggle is ad hoc pricing. One deal is cost plus, one deal is market based, one deal is value based, and that never ends up in the right place, because you have these my favorite most favored nation clauses that some big companies require. One company hears that he paid more than another company just through the through through other communications with their friends in the industry and things, so you got to get your arms around consistency of how you build your pricing strategy, and pick one of those, because as I'm sure you can probably guess, is cost base is got all the downstream implications of adding to a cost amount versus a value base that starts from a very different place. And so each of those cross-functional organizations has got to have the right message, the right tools, the right inputs, the right research, the right kind of things to bring that pricing strategy together in a way that appears cohesive to the potential buyer. Anyway.
Yeah, no, that's good. I mean, we could probably spend another 20 minutes on that question alone. But, I do want to be respectful of everyone's time today and the hour that we had allotted for the webinar. Everyone can see Randy's email address and Bo's email address there. Please jot that down before you sign off today if you want to follow up with any questions or any comments about the webcast and about this subject. I would like to thank everyone for attending, and thank you everyone for the great questions. There were a few. If we weren't able to answer those, we will get those answered after we sign off. Randy, I'd like to thank you again for taking the time today as well, doing double duty for this webcast in Bo's absence. I appreciate that. And with that, this concludes today's webinar. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Good. Thank you, everybody.
The organizer has